There are so many statistics to look at while you're evaluating a wide receiver in fantasy football. I mean, you can go through, you can look at his target rate, his touchdown rate. You can go through and look at his yards per game, his market. It's confusing. It's so overwhelming. So what I hope to do in this video is I hope to take an in-depth look at touchdown rate and why we should be actively avoiding players that were fantastic in this statistic in previous seasons. I'm going to do my best to lay it out, to explain it, to sell my case. And at the end of the video, I am going to pull up a couple players that I am worried about with touchdown rate and maybe some guys we should be avoiding entirely this season. But of course, before we get into it, please go down there, drop a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you play fantasy football. And if for whatever reason you're not in a fantasy football draft this week, if you're not in a fantasy football draft today, go fix that. Go sign up for Underdog Fantasy, where you can draft 365 days a year. I know y'all have seen me live streaming those drafts legitimately every day over the past month because there's nothing more fun. You don't submit your starting lineup. You don't do waivers. It's all done for you. So when you sign up for Underdog Fantasy, please go and use promo code FLOCK and they'll match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to $100. You'll get our 2022 rankings, our dynasty rankings, our dynasty rookie draft guide. And most importantly, you'll have some fun. You'll get into drafts with us on the live stream, or you can go draft with your friends or in the public, whatever you want to do. Just make sure you use promo code FLOCK. And I think that should be it. Let's go through and let's look at touchdown rate. And before we even dive into how volatile this statistic is season to season, I want to pull up the perfect example. He is the poster boy of why you should look at touchdown rate and why it should add some players on your do not draft list. Like right now, I'm going to get a couple names. We're going to get our do not draft list out here. And you better believe we're adding a name or two by the end of this video. Perfect example from last year, Robert Tonyan, a player that I don't know if I ever in a million years took out of the 200 plus drafts we did on Underdog Fantasy last season. And it was because he was so clearly destined to fail expectations for fantasy football drafters, because going 2 years ago in 2020, he was coming off a season where he was first in the NFL with his touchdowns per target. He was averaging about 1 touchdown for every 5 to 6 targets he had this season. That put him first in the NFL by a country mile. Then if you go over and you look at some other measures, if you look at his targets per game, he was 25th among tight ends. If you look at his intended air yards per game, he was 21st among tight ends. So you're like, okay, this is not adding up here. And in 2021, nothing really changed with his role in Green Bay. Instead of being 21st in the NFL at the tight end position with air yards per game, he was 17th. He got a little bit better. Now, his targets per game fell slightly. He was 29th instead of 25th, but those stayed the same. What changed was that touchdown rate. He went from being first in the NFL on a touchdown per target basis to 17th at the tight end position. It's nothing to do with Robert Tonyan himself. He plays in a great offense, and now that people have a more realistic expectation of him going forward, hell, I'm fine drafting Robert Tonyan this season, but not last year when people were taking him as a mid tight end 1 when he was getting tight end 3 volume. It was laughably bad. Now, if we dive into how volatile touchdown rate is season to season, what I wanted to do is I wanted to go through and I wanted to pull up the top 24 wide receivers every year since 2019. So we're going to look at 2019, 2020, and 2021, and we are going to plot the top 24 finishers from their touchdown rates, their touchdowns per target, while creating a threshold of 50 targets for any player. So if we go through and mark this out, there were a couple findings of these 72 placements. 3 times 24, that's going to be 72. There were players that, of course, finished in the top 24 in the NFL in 2019, in 2020, and 2021. A player we'll talk about a little bit later accomplished this. Mike Evans finished in the top 24 every single season. You saw this with DK Metcalf. You saw this with Tyler Lockett. There were players that were able to repeat, but there were a lot of guys, a ton of wide receivers that came up popped up, say in 2020, someone like Chase Claypool, that was the 12th wide receiver with his touchdown rate, and falls off the face of the planet the next year. There were actually 59% of these wide receivers were able to make one of these lists and not the other. That's a very high mark. That's a very high churn through rate. Now, one thing I want to point out, and this is going to matter later on when we're trying to identify players we should be avoiding and trying to identify players we should be drafting. 55.5% of the finishers in the top 24 in any season in touchdown rate came from a top 10 offense that season. 55% came from a top 10 offense. So what this tells us is while touchdown rate is very difficult to predict season to season, while it is very difficult to predict a singular player to have an above average touchdown rate, hell, what you do know is if you want to try to chase that, what you need to be doing is you need to be betting on great offenses. You need to be betting on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. You need to be betting on the Dallas Cowboys. You need to go out there and bet on the Packers, bet on the Chiefs, these teams that do it every single season. And if you want to assume someone like Gabriel Davis will have a higher touchdown rate than league average, hell yeah, you go do you, because he's with Josh Allen. But we'll use that a little bit later on. And just as a baseline, I want to show y'all what a regular turnover rate looks like if we're looking at key statistics and how important they are and how predictive they are season to season. So I also went through and I tracked the top 24 finishers at the wide receiver positions with yards per route run. I think this is going to be a much stickier statistic in predicting future fantasy success. And we did the same thing, top 24 finishes over the 3 seasons. You'll see it looks like a completely different list, but there were only 43% of this list that finished in the top 24 any particular season and did not repeat during this 3-year time period. So that's a pretty large delta between the two. You can see that a statistic like yards per route run is predictive, while touchdown rate itself is not. So now we can use that and we can go through and we could look at some of the wide receivers that were at the very top of the NFL with touchdown rate this past season. Guys that you have, let's just go through the top 5. You have Mike Evans, Allen Lazard, DeAndre Hopkins, Jamar Chase, and Adam Thielen. Now, I want to be completely honest. No, you cannot use this statistic and this statistic alone to say, okay, well, Mike Evans, yeah, he was number 1 in the NFL in touchdown rate, so that means he is going to regress this upcoming season. That means he's going to be back. No, you can't say that, because if you go through and if you look at Mike Evans, we have to ask ourselves a couple questions. Okay, so with Mike Evans, does it make sense for him to have a touchdown rate significantly higher than league average? Let's think about it. Okay, well, he is a 6'5" wide receiver. Okay, but that checks a box for him to probably have some serious touchdown upside. He plays in arguably a top 3 passing offense in the NFL that throws the ball consistently when they get to the red zone. Okay, another major box checked. And what's another box we can look for? Repeating, going through and doing this multiple times before. And Mike Evans not only finished, that's the number 1 wide receiver with his touchdown rate in 2021, but he finished number 1 in 2020 as well. He finished in the top 24 in 2019. This is someone that is always, and I repeat, always scoring touchdowns. Now, I will say with Evans, there are some things that are slightly concerning with this profile. Like if you pull it up and you look at his target share has been steadily declining since 2019. It was at 23% in 2019, that fabulous year where you had Jameis Winston just coming out and burning everything with Godwin and Mike Evans. Since then, it fell to 17.8% in 2020 and 16.4% in 2021. That is a major red flag. And if it was with a different player, I would be significantly more concerned. You see the same thing here if you're going to be looking at his air yards. You're looking at his air yards drop off from 152 per game to 85 and 93 over the past 2 seasons. You see this with his yards per route run. It went from 2.4 in 2019 to 1.9 in 2020 to 1.8 this past year. So there are a lot of red flags, a lot of alarms going off saying, You should be concerned that Mike Evans is slowing down. You should be concerned that Mike Evans is not the same wide receiver that he was when he's 27. But to say you can't draft him in fantasy because of so doesn't make a lot of sense. Because while he is slowing down, and that may be true, at the end of the day, the competition for targets that he has this upcoming season is dramatically lessened with Chris Godwin coming back from a significant injury, Chris Godwin potentially missing the beginning of the season. And also, while yes, they do bring in Russell Gage, Antonio Brown's leaving. Antonio Brown last year, if you look at advanced efficiency metrics, he was still one of the best wide receivers in the NFL, as crazy as that sounds. So while yes, Mike Evans is possibly a worse player now than he has been in years past, you can't just use one statistic and you can't just go through and say he's worse. No, you can still draft him at the end of the second, still draft him. I mean, at the beginning of the third, we were screaming that he was the best value in fantasy football. Now it's not necessarily the case now that he is going in the mid-second of pretty much every single underdog draft. I wanted to bring Evans up in saying, well, yes, that touchdown rate should come down from 12.2%. You can't say you're not drafting him because of so. Because he's still going to have a great touchdown rate compared to league average based on all the boxes that he does check. And at the same time, you have to look at a situation. So it's not as easy as saying, okay, this statistic shows us you can't draft him. It's a tool in your toolbox. Another example of a player, before we get to the guys not to draft, another example of someone you can't use this with is going to be Jamar Chase. Now, if we pull up Jamar Chase versus T. Higgins, I was very early on saying that Justin Jefferson is someone that you should be drafting over Jamar Chase in fantasy football this upcoming season. Like, I thought I was going to be lower on Jamar Chase than most because he started off on Underdog Fantasy being drafted behind Jefferson. Looks like people have fixed this, but I can't tell you now to go through and avoid Jamar Chase in the middle of the first round. Because if we go through and if we look at this, while yes, T. Higgins had a higher target share on a per game basis. T. Higgins actually accounted for 23.6% of this team's target share compared to Jamar Chase at 22%. And Jamar Chase had a significantly higher touchdown rate. Jamar Chase's touchdown rate was at 10.15 compared to T. Higgins at 5.45. So I think that you will have these touchdown rates coming to meet in the middle, possibly around 7 to 8% in the Cincinnati Bengals offense. But can we use this and use this alone to say, okay, well, no, God, we can't draft Jamar Chase. No, you can't say you're not drafting Jamar Chase this upcoming season because Jamar Chase, if we look at this situation, he's probably getting better. He was a rookie last season, and you historically see that rookies that show that elite level of efficiency then are able to command more volume in the following seasons where you may not be able to project that from a veteran in particular. So there are outliers, guys that you'll look at the top of the league in touchdown rate and say, yeah, they were the top of the NFL in touchdown rate, a highly volatile statistic, but I'm still drafting them in fantasy. Chase, Mike Evans will be players that fit that mold. Now, one guy, going back to what we were speaking on with Mike Evans and just looking at some aspects of his game that are concerning, DeAndre Hopkins, I'm scared of. I am terrified of DeAndre Hopkins right now. And that if you go through and if you look at every predictive measure, if you go through and if you look at everything that we want to try to evaluate, let's go over to his targets. He actually averaged 10 targets a game in 2019, 10 targets a game in 2020. That fell down to 6.4 this past season. If you look at his target share in his respective offense, it has gone down steadily. It went from 29.5% in 2019 to 27.5% in 2020 to 2021, down at 18.5%. Now, he was bad in fantasy compared to where you drafted him. In 2019, 2015, he was the top 5 wide receiver. In 2021, he was still a top 24 option on a per game basis. But what happened? What happened is the touchdowns dramatically went up. Despite having only 60% of the targets from the previous season, he over doubled his touchdowns per game. Over doubled. His touchdown rate went from 3.7%, where historically it's hovering around 5% for DeAndre Hopkins. It jacked up to 12.5%. Every mark here is concerning. The targets are down. The yards per route run are down. Those were at 2.1 and 2.4 over the past 2 seasons, and it fell to 2 this past year. His air yards went from 103 and 95 to 78. The fantasy production was saved simply because the touchdowns. So if we start to add this is a different story than what we have with Mike Evans. I am way more concerned with DeAndre Hopkins. He has added target competition with Hollywood Brown coming over. Yes, Christian Kirk leaves. Hollywood Brown's a better wide receiver than Christian Kirk. And we saw the drop off already this past year. It was somewhat saved by his touchdown rate. He's an older wide receiver as well. At the beginning of the offseason, I was saying, you know what? I could probably find myself drafting DeAndre Hopkins this year. After the PED suspension, I think Hopkins may be trying to cover up for the fact that he's just simply not the same wide receiver that he was before. And I do not think you should let the touchdown rate last season save your opinion of him in fantasy football. Hopkins is a player I think we have to lower down. I think you have to lower him down in your rankings. Now, going over to a couple tight ends here, let's try to find the next Robert Tonyan. We're going to have two younger guys here. We're going to have Dawson Knox and Pat Freiermuth pulled up. Now, with Dawson Knox, he actually had the higher touchdown rate. We'll get to him in just 1 second because the player I actually think that we should be avoiding instead is going to be Pat Freiermuth. Because if we go through and if we look at this, with Pat Freiermuth, this is someone that had 79 targets through 16 games last season. And he was very efficient with these. He should take a step forward this upcoming season. But his touchdown rate was closing in on 9% for the Pittsburgh Steelers. This was significantly ahead of Deontay Johnson. This was significantly ahead of Chase Claypool. And now they go through and they add in George Pickens. And if we have to bet on a player to beat the league average, to be elite in a statistical category that's volatile year to year, what are we looking for again, guys? We are looking for that offense to be a top 10 offense in the NFL. Do we think that is possible this upcoming season with the Pittsburgh Steelers with the combination of Kenny Pickett and Mitchell Trubisky? I am uncertain of that. I personally would bet against it. And for that reason, if I'm looking at a player like Freiermuth, he's older than someone like Cole Kmet. I mean, I know he was a rookie last year, but I would probably rather go through and draft Cole Kmet later, someone that showed the ability to have a higher target share of his own offense. And like I said, he'll continue to develop. He's younger than Pat Freiermuth. However, Freiermuth was the one that scored the touchdowns last season. But as we've showed, that's not predictive going forward. And while, yes, I hate the Chicago Bears offense, it's not like you can say Pittsburgh is going to be an elite offense supporting Freiermuth. And here going over to Dawson Knox, the touchdown rate, very, very concerning. 9 touchdowns through 71 targets. Those are almost Robert Tonyan levels. That is very concerning. But I am hesitant to just label Dawson Knox as Robert Tonyan right away. Because what I will say is, with Knox, A, he looked like a better prospect coming into the NFL, and B, probably more importantly, he projects to have a larger role in this Buffalo Bills offense than what you would assume from a target share perspective of Robert Tonyan in Green Bay. Where if you're looking at Dawson Knox, I know everybody wants to get very excited about Gabriel Davis, but Knox may be the second receiving option in Buffalo this upcoming season. He may be the number 2 behind Stephon Diggs. And what were the boxes we are looking for? If we ever want to say that a player has a shot at dramatically exceeding what we are going to be looking at with touchdown rates, you need them to be in the top 10 offense in the NFL. Dawson Knox is in that. Dawson Knox is in Buffalo. So if I'm betting on one of these tight ends to be able to continue to score touchdowns, that's going to be Dawson Knox. Please let me know what y'all thought of this video. Let me know if this helps me going through my process and saying this statistic matters. Here's how I am personally applying it. Here's where I think we can use it to avoid a certain wide receiver like DeAndre Hopkins, a certain tight end like Pat Freiermuth, and we can still acknowledge that there are some outliers. You're looking at a Jamar Chase, you're looking at a Mike Evans, you're looking at a Dawson Knox as players that had probably an unsustainable touchdown rate, but you cannot avoid them in fantasy football based on a multitude of their own reasons, specifically, probably most importantly, the talent combined with the passing offense they are playing in. But I think that's all I got for you. Of course, if you have not done so already, please go down there, drop a like on this video, subscribe to the channel. If you want to go draft these players or you want to go let your idiot league mates draft them, go sign up for Underdog Fantasy. Hop in a live stream with us later this week or today or tomorrow, whatever you're watching this. We'll be streaming every day. And yeah, that's all I got for you. I really hope you have a great day and hope we get to see you out with the stream tonight.